Nothing scares an atheist, or so they'd have you believe. For Hector Greatorix, intellect, charisma, and a complete lack of faith mean a life lived to the fullest, freed from his vows and called by his friends the Bishop of Hell. This scandalous, defrocked clergyman can drink and debauch right to the end, with no fear of the consequences. Will this Bishop of Hell cheat justice, or will something claim him? Join me, Tony Walker, flawed but human, on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast for Marjorie Bowen's The Bishop of Hell.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back.
The Bishop of Hell by Marjorie Bowen. The Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. King Lear. England, 1790. This is the most awful story that I know. I feel constrained to write down the facts as they ever abide with me, praying, as I do so, a merciful God to pardon my small share therein. God have mercy on us all. In the hope, vain though I feel it to be, that when I have written down this tale it may cease to haunt me, I here begin. It was 20 years ago, and never since, day nor night, have I had any respite from the thought of this story, through which you can hear the drums of hell beat loudly, and yet which has an awful beauty. God have mercy on us all. Hector Greatorix was my friend, yet to say friend is to profane a noble word. Rather, he was my counsellor, companion, and prop in all things evil. His reputation was hideous, even among the rake-helly crowd who flattered and followed him. He went lengths from which others shrank, and his excesses, his impiety, his boldness terrified even those hardened in wicked ways. And what added a deeper edge of horror to his conduct was that he had been an ordained clergyman. Younger son of a younger son, his father had placed him in the church in the hope of rapid preferment, for the Greatorix were a highly placed family, and the great Earl of Culvers was the head of it. But the scandal of young Hector's life was such that even in those days he was unfrocked. His intimates in the clubs and gambling dens called him in bitter derision Bishop of Hell. I write of the year 1770 when this tale begins. Hector Greatorix was then in the height of his fame and fashion. No one could deny him certain splendour. He was literally in physical height head and shoulders above his companions, and mentally also. His wit, his invention, his daring knew no bounds. But all these qualities were turned to evil. He was at this time about 30 years of age, of a magnificent figure, so graceful that his strength was hardly noticeable, tawny-haired and tawny-eyed, with features as yet unblemished from his debaucheries, the most elegant of hands and feet, the most exquisite taste in dress, and the most engaging of manners. There was not one honourable man nor respected woman among his acquaintances, and all his intimates were villains. I do not except myself. There was, however, one exception. Colonel Bulkeley, his cousin on the female side, had helped him by his countenance and by money. Why, I never understood. Because William Bulkeley was the most austere, upright, and punctilious of men, of great wealth, of exceptional position, and of the most distinguished career. I think now, as I thought then, that it was quite impossible for Colonel Bulkeley to realize what Hector Greatorix really was, or the set to which he belonged. The villain could be most plausible, and his cousin must have believed him to be wild, unfortunate, and blamable, but in no way vile or dishonoured. In sum, Colonel Bulkeley effectually played the mediator between Greatorix and the chief of the family, Lord Culvers, who, no anchorite himself, was not ill-disposed towards his handsome and seductive nephew. But then his lordship, who was much disabled by gout, seldom left Greatorix Park, and knew little of London society, so that he was by no means aware of his nephew's reputation. I, as one of the most reputable of his disreputable friends, being, as I can truly say, more wild and young than vicious, was chosen to go with Hector to Greatrix Park when the old Earl asked his company. And so I was able to see at close quarters how this charming knave pulled the wool over the eyes of his two kinsmen. The end of the comedy was an allowance for Greatrix, a handsome subsidy from the Earl, most generously supplemented by a few hundreds more from the wealth of Colonel Bulkeley. Greatrix was to study the law and live in chambers suitable to his rank. He had no chance of accession to the family honours of the Earl, whose heir, a dull, sickly youth enough, had lately married a blooming young woman of a robust constitution, who had provided him with a couple of boys. So Greatrix, thanks to Colonel Bulkeley, had done better than the most sanguine might have hoped, and he seemed more moved thereby than I had thought possible. "Bulkeley has done me a good turn," he swore, "and damn if I'll ever do him a bad one." As for his allowance and the study of the law, he laughed at these things. What he really valued was the countenance of these two great wealthy gentlemen. "This visit will help my credit in London," he declared. "It's good for a couple of years' debt." And what when 2 years are up, and your credit and the patience of your relatives are alike exhausted? "Who am I," smiled Greatrix, "to think 2 years ahead?" I think it was impossible for him to conceive of disaster or even common misfortune. His object gained, he was impatient to return to town. A woman with red hair was waiting for him. He had a curious and persistent passion for women with that bright shade of auburn like burnt gold. Colonel Bulkeley pressed us to stay a night with him on our way to town, and Greatrix, with an inner curse, for he wanted to be free of this formal, austere man, consented with a winning courtesy. Moyle Place was in Kent, quite near London, a commodious and elegant residence presided over by Mrs. Bulkeley, who was some several years younger than her husband. This type of woman was unknown to either Greatrix or myself. I have had no sisters, and could not recall the character or the lineaments of my mother. Greatrix had two sisters, but they were town ladies of smirched reputation, and his mother had been a passionate, reckless, uncommon woman. To both of us, Mrs. Bulkeley appeared flat, childish, almost imbecile, almost incredible. She had been married direct from a Clapham boarding school, and had there received several tokens, as the doting husband let slip, for deportment and good conduct. It was June, and she wore a muslin gown with a wide blue silk sash, and a wide straw hat tied under the chin with another ribbon of the same hue. She lisped a little, and her small face was clearly and definitely coloured like a china ornament. She was, in fact, like the puppets children dress up and play with. Then, when she had gone into the house and was pouring tea behind the bulky silver, pieces that looked larger than herself, she suddenly took off her hat and showed her head, overflowing with auburn curls, long, glossy, almost vermilion, yet soft and like burnt gold, all knotted up on the crown of her head. With this revelation of her hair you saw her beauty, the golden eyes with blonde lashes, the features of such an exquisite delicacy, the pearly shades on throat and neck, the delicious carmine of faint carnation. I didn't care to look at Greatrix, and yet I felt that I need not have suffered this embarrassment. Colonel Bulkeley was the one man in the world for whom Greatrix had expressed any respect or consideration, and the lady obviously adored her husband. I was both amused and surprised to observe the manifestations of sentimental affection between them. There was one child, too, a little doll in white lace just out of the cradle. What fondness Colonel Bulkeley could spare from his wife was devoted to the infant. I was cloyed and thankful when we had taken our seats for town. Greatrix, after the effort of the last few days, was in a surly mood. "I have never passed a couple of days so tiresome," he said. And I, always minded to jeer at him when I could, replied, "You've never seen a woman so beyond your reach, Hector. She never looked at you, I do believe." He laughed indifferently. "Alicia Bulkeley is ready to the hand of any man who likes to reach out for her." What was yet good in me was shocked by this insult to our hostess, a woman who, commonplace and childish, perhaps, had yet seemed to me to convey a sweet purity, a gentle fidelity, and an adoring affection beyond all reproach. "She's in love with her husband," I declared. "The more reason she can be in love with another. 'Tis your passionately attached wives who fall the easiest victims. That little creature is amorous as a lovebird. Take Bulkley away for a month or so, and she'd flutter into any arms held out." "By God, Hector," I swore, "if you can't believe in any nobility or decency, don't defame these qualities. Your words stick in my throat. These people have exerted themselves in kindness towards you. Mrs. Bulkley's silly, maybe, but a gentlewoman deserving of respect." "Since when have you turned Puritan?" he asked coldly. I was not affected by his sneers. I felt a certain definite repulsion against him, and from that day I saw less of him and applied myself with some diligence to my studies. We each of us had rooms in paper buildings, and the more I heard of Hector Greatorix, the more I withdrew myself from his companionship. Two of his boon fellows shot themselves. The daughter of his laundress was found hanged. A married woman of his acquaintance was taken out of a Hampstead pond one winter morning. His name was associated, secretly and somberly, with all these tragedies. Some rumours of these matters must have reached the Earl in his lofty retirement, for I heard from the associates of Greatrix, who still continued to be mine, that there had been a summons to Greatrix Park, quarrels, and the employment once more of Colonel Bulkley as mediator. I had seen little of the Bulkleys. Their severe and yet sentimental life, the chaste simplicity of their connubial bliss, did not greatly attract me. I had been asked again to Moyle Place, and had needed all my fortitude to control my yawns. Mrs. Bulkley had now another infant at her breast, and was more than ever infatuated with her husband. Another 6 months, and this idyllic family was rudely disturbed. Colonel Bulkley's regiment was ordered to India for 3 years, and he was forced to leave abruptly his wife and children he so tenderly loved. That winter, to my surprise, I met Mrs. Bulkley in a London ballroom. It was only a few months since her husband had sailed, and I imagined her consoling herself with her babies at Moyle Place. When I spoke to her, she seemed shy and confused. I learned that she had moped in the country, that a doctor had ordered a change, and that these insufferable years of waiting would seem shorter amid the distractions of society. She was staying with a married brother at St. James's, and I couldn't doubt that she was well protected, both by her own heart, her position, her relatives, her children. Yet, when I saw her dancing with Hector Greatorix, I did not care to watch. Needless to follow the course of an experienced and heartless seducer, suffice it to say that Greatorix was soon talked of in connection with Mrs. Bulkley, and, unattainable as I believed her to be, I could not forbear an appeal to her pursuer. I found him, by rare luck, in his chambers. "For God's sake, Hector," I conjured him, "stop your attentions to Mrs. Bulkley. Even though it is impossible for you to destroy her peace of mind, you may blight her reputation." "What is this to me?" he asked coldly. "Did I not tell you she would come at my whistle?" I urged him to forbear. "Never before have you compromised a woman of her position. Consider what it'll mean to you. The fury of your uncle and of her husband. The scandal will put you out of society, out of England." "And there," he interrupted, "I am likely to go in any case. I can keep the duns quiet no longer, and my lord will be bled no more." I told him I hoped he would go before Mrs. Bulkley's good name was smirched by his detestable attentions, and I reminded him solemnly of his obligations towards Colonel Bulkley. He had no answer for me, and soon after I observed with relief that Mr. Lambert, Alicia Bulkley's brother, had taken alarm, and that she was being kept from any opportunity of meeting Greatorix. Yet what availed this? Hector Greatorix, having spun his credit to the utmost, and within a few hours of the Fleet prison for debt, fled to the Continent, and Alicia Bulkley went with him. Though I was never squeamish in these affairs, I will confess that this completely sickened me. The man was so vile, The woman so infantile, so pure, so attached to her husband. The scandal was hideous. The Earl cut Hector off with a curse. The Lamberts adopted the abandoned children, and as soon as they had news of Alicia, sent her a small allowance that was probably the main support of the wretched couple. This money was sent care of a bank in Genoa, but no one knew where Mrs. Bulkeley and her lover really were living. Through the compassion of His Royal Highness, who had the chief command in India, Colonel Bulkeley was allowed to return to England on the receipt of the awful news, and arrived in London something less than 2 years since he had sailed. He immediately resigned his commission and returned with his children to Moyle Place. Declaring that he had no intention of following the fugitives, he said simply that if Greatrix ever returned to England, one of the two would, in a few days, be dead, and Mr. Lambert, with his next remittance, reported this message, advising his unfortunate sister and her paramour to keep clear of their native country for fear of further scandal and horror. I avoided the possible chance of meeting Colonel Bulkeley. I had no desire to see this broken and outraged man, whose career that had promised so splendidly was broken in the middle, and for whom life seemed to hold nothing but bitterness and humiliation. This, it might seem, should be the end of the story. It indeed appeared that nothing further could happen, either to the outcasts in their exile or to the betrayed husband, to alter the position of either or in any way bring them together again. But who would have guessed at the turn fate had in store? Colonel Bulkeley had not been home much more than another 2 years when a severe epidemic of smallpox broke out in England. Among the first victims were the wife and children of Lord Culvers. The son by his first marriage, always delicate, had lately died of a decline, and the old Earl, then over 70 years of age, did not long endure the shock, but sank under the weight of his bereavement, a few days after the funeral of his youngest child. The estates and the money were both entailed, every portion of property having been strictly tied up by a preceding Earl, and Hector Greatorix was now Earl of Culvers, and one of the wealthiest noblemen in England. Lord Culvers was summoned to London by his lawyers, and on the same day Colonel Bulkeley came up from Moyle Place and took a house in Dover Street, Mayfair, not far from his lordship's town mansion, Culver House. Hector came as far as Paris, and there stopped. He still had Mrs. Bulkeley with him, not, as I suppose, from any remnants of affection, but because of her allowance, which, till now, was his sole means of support. I winced to think what Alicia Bulkeley must be like now. There had never been any talk of a divorce, but now people began to ask why Colonel Bulkeley did not permit his wife to marry her lover. They were people who did not know Hector. I received unexpectedly a summons from my lord to attend him in Paris. He had not too many reputable acquaintances then, and I had become a respectable enough citizen while he was sliding down to pandemonium. Therefore, I supposed, this dubious honour. I went, as one will, partly out of curiosity, partly out of complacence, and partly out of a faint pity for Alicia Bulkeley. He had, of course, handled plenty of money already, and upset as the city still was, I found them elegantly installed in an hôtel meublé that had only lately become national property. Hector was sumptuous to behold, and cordial enough in his wild way. He had changed for the worse. The first bloom of his beauty had gone, the first fineness of his manners, but he was handsome enough, God help him. She was with him. I learnt afterwards that she had had and lost in the feverish heat of Italy 3 children, and never had she been without another woman sharing her lover's favours. Often these lived under the same roof with her. She had known, I think, most of the humiliations possible to a refined woman who lives with a vile, brutal man. There could have been little of horror and squalor that she hadn't seen, nay, been in the midst of. I could hardly keep curiosity from my eyes. This was the doll of Moyle Place, with her lisp, her muslin, her babies. She was, and this is perhaps the most horrible thing, much more beautiful, rich, opulent in line now, with a full bosom and flowing curves of thighs and shoulders. Taller she had been but 18, clever at dressing, clever of speech, gay, abandoned, and intolerably wretched. Her tone was one of bravado, but the look in her eyes was that of a whipped dog who creeps away from the lash. As soon as we were alone, she was down on her knees to me with a movement so passionately sudden that I could in no way prevent it. On her knees, Mrs. Bulkeley of Moyle Place. "Tell me," she implored, "will not William divorce me? Surely you have some message from him?" I told her, "None." She began to weep. "If I were free, Hector might marry me before he returned to England. That is my only hope." "Surely, madam," said I in pity, "a vain one." But she was not yet free of the illusion women are so slow to lose, that they always have some power over a man who has once loved them or been their lover, and she cherished the desperate hope that her husband might set her free, and she regained something of all she had lost under the name of Lady Culvers. Never was there a more futile and piteous hope even in the brain of a foolish woman. I could not forbear saying to her, when I had induced her to rise from her knees, "Madam, has not your association with my lord shown you the manner of man he is?" "Indeed it has," she answered bitterly. "Yet surely he could not, in these changed circumstances, abandon me." So she clung to the protection of that honour she had herself discarded, and a panic terror showed in her eyes as she added that she had now nothing with which to keep him. It had always been the money that had held him, the money the Lamberts sent, and, heaven avert its face, other money, presents from Italian lovers of hers whom he had forced on her, she told me, with a wildness that made me fear for her reason, that she had paid for her last child's funeral by such means. "And yet, madam," I shuddered, "you wish to continue your association with such a monster. Indeed, I wonder that you have already not left him, if only for the protection of another man." As she was silent, I added, "Is it possible that you love him?" She replied, "No, I have never loved any but William and my dear, dear children." But I doubt if she knew what love was, and I think that for months she had known no emotion save fear. Seeking to abate her misery, I asked her what she could dread worse than what had yet befallen her. "There's hell," she said. "I should think," I replied, "that hell is where my lord is." But no, to her, still at heart a religious, respectable English gentlewoman, anything was preferable to the life of open shame before her. If my lord forsook her, she thought, in her narrow, ignorant mind, that if she could marry her lover, her fault would be condoned, and I knew that in the eyes of many it would be. I advised her that she could go into retreat somewhere with the money that the Lamberts allowed her, but she shook her head with a feeble laugh. She knew, she said, with a dreadful accent, her own weakness, and she saw herself, once cast off by my lord, sinking to the lowest depths of degradation till she reached Bridewell or a foreign lazar house. And I could see this too. I promised to speak to my lord, but naturally with little hope. But the next day, when I saw him sitting over his breakfast playing with his dogs, he gave me no opening, for he plunged into his own affairs. "Looky here, Jack," he said, "I was too drunk yesterday to talk business, and when I came back from the opera, you'd gone. But this is the matter I've sent you for. Has Bulkeley seen reason? As I've no news, I take it he's gone to his prayers and his pumpkins at Moyle Place, and will give no trouble." "No," I said. "Colonel Bulkeley came up to London as soon as he heard of your fortune, and has taken lodgings in Dover Street. 'Tis said that he keeps a watch posted by Culver House for your return." My lord's face turned ashy. "What for?" he cried. "That he may challenge you the moment that you set foot in England." My lord sprang up then. His rage was diabolic. There's no other word for this fury of a fiend outwitted at last. His oaths and blasphemies were detestable, atrocious, as he strode up and down with his dressing-gown flowing open, and his locks damp from last night's debauch seeming to rise on his head. "I never heard," I said, wincing, "that you were a coward, Hector. But it seems you are." "Coward!" he yelled. "When I eloped with Bulkeley's wife, I was a ruined man without a prospect in the world. Did I think I'd ever want to return to England with the title and the money? He had been, in fact, exquisitely caught, but I could feel no spark of compassion for him. "You'll have to meet the man," I told him, not looking at his distorted face. "I'll not. Bulkeley's a damn good shot. Do you think I want to go it when I've suddenly got everything to my hand?" I could guess that he did not. To him, the position, the money, meant the opening of paradise. He would, no doubt, have a good life. Fine flatterers, fine women, all that wealth could buy in London would be his. Nay, there would be plenty who would receive him in the finest society of the town, and not scruple to offer him their daughters in honourable matrimony. The hounded exile would be the great lord, and at last able to get full value for his rank, his beauty, his audacity, his fascination. "I stay in Paris," he cried. "People will come over to me here. I'll cheat the man that way. Paris is as well as London, if you have money." "It were wiser, perhaps," I said with disgust, "but no one will endure a man who is an avowed coward, my lord. You'll have to keep the company you've been used to lately if you stay out of England. People will know why. They're beginning to say already that you linger. I, for one," and I rose, "would turn my back on you." "Blast your impudence, Jack," he whispered. "What is this tone to me?" "Your peer of England. Culvers is a great name. It'll cover much, but not cowardice." "Damn that word. I don't want to die. That's reasonable." "Yes, if I were you, my lord, I should not want to die." "Bah, you're thinking of my bishopric. Hell, as if I believed in hell. There's nothing, not even hell, Jack. One goes out like a snuffed candle. Just blackness, blackness, nothingness, nothingness." The look on his face as he said this was one of such awful despair that I thought this was a moment when he might be softened by his own terrors. "I can see one possible way out, Hector. If you were to let Colonel Bulkeley know that if he divorced his wife you would marry her, perhaps for her sake, he would forego his revenge." He laughed in my face. "The woman's been the harlot of half the rogues in Italy." I stopped him. "Don't talk of that. Even your corroded heart might blench there. Marry her if you can, for your soul's sake, and hers." His hideous pride was greater than his fear. "A kept woman," he mocked. "My God, I'm Culvers now." "Remember it," I recommended him. "What do you mean to do with this poor creature?" Then, as if he remembered that she was the original cause of his present predicament, he began to curse her, using those abominable names he so freely applied to women. And as for what he meant to do with her, his project was what the miserable wretch had herself guessed: complete abandonment, and his view of her future was her view, the streets and the Maison de Dieu. I reminded him of her birth and upbringing, of her relatives, but he only redoubled his blasphemies. "Am I answerable if these Puritans breed women who run into the gutter?" I left him, useless to contemplate a spectacle so frightful, and I avoided any further interview with Alicia Bulkeley. When I returned to London, I observed the watcher set by Colonel Bulkeley near the shuttered gloom of Culver House. In 3 months' time my lord returned to London, whether urged thereto by the jeers of his enemies, the flatteries of his friends, or his own pride, or whether unable to endure his tantalus position, or whether his nerve broke at the suspense and the waiting, I know not, but he came to London. I had heard that he had hopes of approaching Bulkeley with offers of apology or even money, of seeking in some way an accommodation. This sounded ridiculous, but from his nature it was possible to conclude that he cherished some such plan. He arrived in London secretly, with a horrid stealth, and slipped into Culver House under cover of a November evening. Yet the next morning Lord Mildmay called on him with a challenge from Colonel Bulkeley. That same evening I was summoned to Culver House. My lord sat with some of his old boon companions in one of the dismantled rooms, for his coming had been sudden and unexpected. The holland covers were yet over the great velvet and gilt chairs, muslin bags enveloped the candelabra, and where the bottles and glasses stood on the ornate table were rings in the dust. Candles had been hastily stuck into tarnished sticks, and the only other servants were the French rascals my lord had brought with him. Rosy amorini and florid wreaths peeped from the shadows of the imposing walls, and the lordly pomp of this chill magnificence was a strange background for the men drinking by the huge fire on the marble hearth. Everyone was drunk but my lord, but he, this night, could find no oblivion in the wine-cup. Panic kept his head clear, and I could see by the ferocious anguish of his face that his thoughts were by no means dimmed. He met me with bravado. "If I go to hell tomorrow, I'll pay you a visit to let you know what's like." "Is Bulkeley so infallible?" asked one of his followers, and another with tipsy malice. "He's a damn good shot." "He has on his side justice, at least," I said coldly, for I had now come to detest my lord. He looked at me in agony. "Say I've a chance," he muttered, and I smiled, always having believed him to be of an invincible courage. For all that, I thought his chance good enough. If Bulkeley was a fine marksman, so was my lord. "Why don't you get to bed? What time is the meeting?" I looked with contempt at his hideous company. Not one of them had set foot in Culver House or any mansion like it before. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning," said one, Hilton, the soberest of the wretched band, and my lord's second. It was now past midnight. "Why have you sent for me?" I asked again. He was pacing up and down the room in a very climax of terror and rage, while the drunken crew round the table condoled with it and mocked him in a breath. He wore an almond-green velvet coat, overlaced, I recall, with silver, for that year the men's clothes began to be very plain, and his hair was long and powdered in the old-fashioned style still favoured in Italy. I think that the beauty of his lineaments rendered his expression the more awful, the despair, the dread, the fury expressed in that pale visage were awful indeed to contemplate. "I will not go," he cried. "I'll not stand up and be killed." He then asked me to make his will. I was by then a lawyer of some modest standing, for the Culver property was his to dispose of, since he was the last male of his family. Yet when it came to asking his wishes, he would not reply, and finally refused to consider the matter, and so I left him, staring into the huge mirror with a glass of brandy in his hand, and cursing the clock for marking the passage of the time. I had not dared to ask him anything of Alicia Bulkeley, but as I was leaving I did demand particulars of the lady from one of the servants, a man I had seen in Paris. She had been left in Paris, quieted, I gathered, by some lie as to my lord's return. This affair, and mainly the memory of my lord's face, so wrought on my mind that I could not sleep that night, and went out early for news of the duel. I got this from the creature Hilton, the second. The meeting had taken place in Hyde Park, and at the first shot my lord had fallen. "Killed?" asked Colonel Bulkeley. "Sir," said the surgeon, bending over the writhing man, "death would have been more merciful. He is shot through the jaw." "He is marked where I aimed to mark him," replied the implacable soldier coldly. "He will never kiss another man's wife again, nor his own, nor even any drab from Whitefriars." With that remark he left the park. His austere figure and his sombre countenance had never changed during the course of the encounter. My lord was carried home in his carriage. He soon became unconscious, for the lower part of his face was shattered, half blown away, and though he might well live, he would never be anything but a mask of terror. Alicia Bulkeley, quieted for the moment by my lord's lies, no sooner lost sight of him than she fell into a fierce panic and resolved to follow him by the next packet. With little more than the price of her journey in her pocket, and accompanied by a huge negress who was her last attendant, she landed at Dover 24 hours after my lord, and took the night coach to London. Arriving there, the demented creature could think of no asylum but Culver House, and as she could hardly believe that the man for whom she had sacrificed everything, and with whom she had lived for years, would refuse her shelter, she directed her steps to the stately mansion of my lord. The valet who opened to her knew her, and was for refusing admission, but the negress said cunningly, Mrs. Bulkeley being past coherent speech, that my lord had sent for them. The servant, not knowing if this might be so, reluctantly admitted them. The two shuddering and draggled women had just reached the great doors on the first landing when my lord came home. He had regained consciousness, and though his pain was fearful, he had no tongue to make lament with. He walked between Hilton and the surgeon, who were indeed not well able to carry so large a man, and so slowly came up the wide treads of the stair to where Mrs. Bulkeley, who had heard the steps, cowered against the door, her silk shawl, her fallen hair, her bonnet disarranged, her face like milk, her lips ashy. As my lord came into view, with his jaw swathed in bloody bandages, and his terrible eyes above them, she broke into shriek after shriek. My lord sprang forward with a strength that made nothing of those who held him, took the frail wretch in his quivering hands, and hurled her down the stairs. The surgeon tried to catch her, but she was weak, and her high heel caught in her dress. She fell to the bottom of the flight, and lay in the hall. Whimpering, the negress scuttled after her. Hilton, to please his patron, from whom he still hoped favour, said, "It's Alicia Bulkeley, the cause of the whole damned business. Turn her out," he added to the gibbering valet. The surgeon, who was a fashionable man and feed by my lord, made no protest, and as the earl was led to his chamber, the servant and the negress picked up Mrs. Bulkeley and carried her into the street. She stirred as they touched her, and the black woman clamoured for pity, so that the valet consented to carry her to a pothouse nearby, where the landlady, after marking her rings and watch, took her in and let her lie in a back room, where the customers came and stared at her, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and beer. She asked for her husband and the clergyman, but the negress was too ignorant to know what she meant, and so, about noon, she died, aged not quite 23 years. It was a clear case of murder, but the landlady and her gossip, the slippered doctor, hushed the thing up, robbed her of her rings, watch, silk, and linen garments, and even the burnt gold hair that had first attracted my lord, and buried her in a pauper's grave. The negress they turned into the street, and she, distracted with terror, crept back to Culver House and begged for scraps at the kitchen door. There, out of compassion, they gave her my name and where I was to be found, and I discovered her on my stairs when I came home that night, and so learnt from her the manner of Alicia Bulkeley's death. I sent the poor wretch to a friend who had a house of servants, and debated whether or not I should write these matters to Colonel Bulkeley. I was not encouraged to do so by the remembrance of his face on the morning of the duel, and while I hesitated, I had news of the death of my lord. This was practically suicide, because his life had never been in danger, but he tore off the bandages with a ruthless hand, turned his mutilated face to the wall, and furiously died, the day of the burial of Alicia Bulkeley. Would that this were the end, and that I, who believed in neither heaven nor hell, could have here finished with Hector Greatorix, 7th Earl of Culvers. I went out that day to a gathering of people who knew nothing of my lord, and stayed late, endeavouring to forget. I drank and danced and gambled, and fled the gossips who must mouth over the Culvers scandal. When I returned, I found that the light on the stairs, commonly left there by my laundress, had gone out, so must fumble my way up in the dark and silence of the quiet building. When I reached my room, I must fumble again in the dark for flint and tinder, feeling from one piece of furniture to another. It was cold, and through the tall window I could see the moon like an icicle in the dark sky. At last, when I had begun to be considerably oppressed by the dark, I found the tinder box and struck a light. As I set the flaming tinder to the candle, I perceived that I was not alone in the room. Someone was seated in the hooded chair that had its back towards me. A man. I could see the white hand hanging down, the skirt of a coat on which some bullion trimming gleamed. I concluded that a friend, minded to pay me a visit, had gone to sleep, awaiting my return. I approached, holding my light, and with I know not what feeling of unfathomable dread. The figure turned as I neared. It was my lord. He wore the almond green suit with the silver braiding in which I had already seen him hold his ghastly vigil of terror and fury. God have mercy on us all. His face was alight. Where the visage should have been was a ripple of flames quivering upwards, and through this crimson veil of fire gleamed his infernal eyes with an expression of unutterable woe. The flames rose above his head, shaped into a peak. He wore a shining mitre glittering with lambent fires of green and blue, like hellish jewels. This fiend had been forced to keep his oath, to discover to another scoffer the truth of hell. My eyes could not long support this atrocious spectacle. As he raised his ashy hand in mock benediction, I fell senseless, seeing as I dropped the demoniacal mitre flare from his flaming brows to a man's height above his tortured eyes.
You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud.
So that was The Bishop of Hell by Marjorie Bowen. Came out in 1949. So Marjorie Bowen, the first thing I've got to tell you is, wasn't her real name. I alwashe say it's always bad to start a relationship with a lie, but that's what she's done to us, because her real name was Margaret Gabrielle Vere Long. She was born 1885, died in 1952, and she wrote works under the pseudonyms, lots of pseudonyms, Marjorie Bowen, Robert Pay, George P. Preedy, Joseph Shearing, and John Winch. Where did she get them from? I mean, it's a phone book, probably. She was prolific, and she wrote over 150 books, many achieving bestseller status in both the UK and the US. And she wrote authentic, although rather melodramatic, historical novels. You can see that, can't you? With The Viper of Milan was her first book, written in 1906, when she was just 16. She wrote that. It was initially dismissed by publishers because they felt young ladies shouldn't be writing about such things as vipers in Milan. I mean, for me, I would have thought it was some kind of treatise on natural history, reptiles of Italy. Maybe she called it that. She would have got it published. But it was a little bit, I think they used to call them, or there was a phrase later on, not early in 1960, called bodice rippers, wasn't there? Anyway, and I didn't find this particular story salacious. I think they became more so, not hers, but the genre of historical novels about wealthy ladies falling in love with rakes and scoundrels. Honestly, it's now in the billionaire romance, isn't it? As long as he's actually, the fact that the man is a rake and a scoundrel seems to make him more attractive. I don't get it, but then potentially I wouldn't. So, but when it did get published, it made so much money, the publisher was like, we didn't really like this, but now we think it's a really great idea, so can you write more? We want it just the same, but different. That's what they say. So, and then she had her mother and a sister, and she paid for them, and her ailing first husband. So she was... people say it was beneath her true abilities, but she was the sole breadwinner. She was born in Hayling Island in Hampshire on the 1st of November 1885, but it wasn't a happy early life. Her parents separated a few years after her birth, and so moved around from cheap apartment to cheap apartment as her mother, Mrs. Vere Campbell, who was an aspiring but unsuccessful playwright, evaded what they call collection agents or bailiffs and relied on charity. So they were not rough as a badger's let me think of a polite tale. But they were gentry down on their luck. Um, yeah, I was going to say much as I'd like to claim I was, but I'm not. Neither down on my luck nor gentry. So Long's mother openly favoured other daughters rather than Margaret, who was Marjorie, who she found unattractive and unintelligent, which is clearly not true. So it's led to a grim childhood where avoiding blame was a primary goal. Her grandmother, or Nana, was described as slovenly, malicious, and skilled only in the intrigues of poverty. I think her father was an alcoholic who abandoned them. So she didn't have a lovely time, really. Her mother spent limited funds on the other daughter's schooling, so Margaret, largely taught herself, painstakingly, deciphering words from the few books available. However, by her early teens, as we know that, 16, she writes this, she frequented the British Museum, immersive. That's why it had a library in it. You need to know that. It wasn't just like statues or Egyptian hieroglyphs. That would have been stunning if she'd managed to become a novelist by reading Egyptian hieroglyphs. But no, there was a library there, a British library, in fact, immersing herself in history, art, and culture. She's got that, hasn't it? It comes across, taking on small jobs as a fact checker. I thought that was a modern thing, fact checking. And I think it means something different. It was actually in the old days actually checking facts for books. If they say that the French Revolution was such and such, they check the fact. I think that's the kind of job it was, rather than the modern fact checker, who seemed to be going out of fashion. I'm glad I didn't train as one, being honest. Short-lived career. Anyway, so she was a ghostwriter. She paid for the family. It was considered amateurish, her first novel, but listen, when it was finally published, it was moderately successful in the UK, but it was a bestseller in the US, transforming Long into a full-time writing machine. She actually didn't think she was that great, but but you can tell when she writes it. She's got a lot of craft there, She knows how to write, I think. And she found relief in writing stories of revenge, murder, and gothic horror. And she claimed it helped her rid her mind of dark thoughts. Same here, absolutely. Long married a Sicilian man in 1912 as more of an escape than out of love. And they were in Italy, and she soon became pregnant. And she wrote an account of her child's delivery at the hands of a superstitious and medically ignorant midwife. Which is apparently terrifying. So her husband then rented a gloomy, unheatable place along the Ligurian coast that lacked food and sat near stagnant water. I'm not sure, the houses usually do lack food until you take it into them, but it must mean something, that sentence, when I wrote it down. Her husband, who was never very healthy, quickly fell ill. I'm not surprised. Began to waste away. For over a year, Marjorie, Margaret, struggled to take care of him, searched for food, haggled with pharmacists, she found wood for the stoves, and kept writing. Long anticipated by her maid, found the professor to care for him. I don't know what that means. The romance with the professor, an elegant Venetian in his late 60s. So she obviously fell in love with this geezer, the professor's, and the affair was proper, and Long promised to marry him after returning to England with her son. However, she received a letter stating that his health was too poor to ever allow them to marry. A second marriage and 2 more children were quickly swept past in her book. I've made a mess of these notes. She later reflected that she should have known how to live simply and pleasantly, but her life was always cut across by the discords of other people's lives. So she wrote all her life and died in December 1952 at St Charles Hospital in Kensington following a fall in her bedroom. Now, I don't know anything about her, but she wasn't that old, was she? Yeah, so she's 15, so 60. No, 69. Often people who fall, this is a gross thing to say, but it's drink, Usually when we had people who were, when you're 80 odd or you fall, you lose your balance, but people who are younger who fall, particularly if you fall down the stairs and stuff like that, it's often to do with alcohol. There we are, a gross generalization. Feel free to call me out on it, but I won't read your comments, so but if you feel better doing it, then do. Let's talk about the Bishop of Hell. Oh, I need to say something about comments. I know, I don't want to whine about this because it's an unattractive quality, but I'm not an Jeffin robot. A lot of people have been saying this is dreadful AI, and the other, yeah. Anyway, so I'm not. So I've decided to combat this by leaving mistakes in. I used to be quite scrupulous about cleaning up the audio, but that seems to be playing against me. So I'm going to leave my mistakes in. I haven't left any swear words in though. When I get something wrong and I curse myself or punch the wall, and I've taken all that out. But I've left some of the slight stumbling over. When I made a real big hash of it, I did change it. Anyway, let's talk about the Bishop of Hell. Bishop of Hell came in 1949 in her collection, The Bishop of Hell and Other Stories. It's a great title for a story. She, by that time, was a very respected writer. It's a historical novel, isn't it? And it's a really interesting, the late 1700s, 1770s. We all know what happened in that period. First of all, the storming of the Bastille in 1789, which was the French Revolution, the sweeping away of the Ancien Régime, this period of several hundred years that was characterized by increasingly decadent aristocracy who were living a life of great wealth while ordinary people were suffering. And of course, across the water, the American Revolution. And a slightly different context in that, the US may feel that it was, and it was removing itself from autocratic power, but it was kind of the same kind of feelings that were going on in Paris. They're seeing these wealthy elites, as we might call them today, living at large, and the sweat of the work, all that tea tax and all that stuff, but being ruled by these people with nothing much to show for what you're paying them, and you're not having a great time. I think the French were having a worse time. I mean, probably we, the peasantry of England, were having not too great a time either. But, I mean, we can all play oppression bingo here. We can all kind of go, it's worse for me. And you can say, we were paying tax on tea. We were paying tax on tea. Do you know they used to smuggle it from the Isle of Man to our coast? And tea, you think, well, tea, so what? Tea was like heroin in its day. It apparently was much stronger then. It used to blow people's heads off. Not literally, but no, I don't think literally. Anyway, so that was bad. So that's when she's talking about when your man, Lord Culver, the swine Greatorix, is in Paris, and Paris is in a bit of a state because of the revolution. So that's the historical background. And I think we did one by her called The Housekeeper, which set it also in the 18th century with rakes. You wonder if I was going to say if her view of men was tainted by her experience of her father, but in this story, in fact, our narrator isn't a bad man really. He realised that he was evil, or he'd done bad things, and then he turned to the light and became a lawyer. That's a joke. No, I'm some of my best friends are lawyers. That's actually probably true, but anyway, that's another story. So I thought that this was really hard on Alicia Bulkley. Remember, this is a female author, and the sisterhood means all women have to be friends. And I don't think she was. I think she was really hard on Alicia Bulkley. She talks about her being, flat, ultimately vapid, empty, and she's so corruptible. I mean, her husband goes away. I mean, okay, fair enough, her husband's gone away for 3 years, but that does happen to people. And she loves him, and this complete naughty man comes and, he's just like, hey, baby, come on. And away she's off. She's off with Lado. terrible. Anyway, so I don't think she comes out very well. Although he does feel pity for her, and I felt pity for her. I thought, poor lass. I thought, she's naive, isn't she? She's innocent, and so we can. But we have to take responsibility for our actions. She abandoned her husband and her children to run around with a complete wad around Europe. Who and couldn't she see that he was that? But maybe not because she was so naive. We've seen it all. We all have friends that have done that, don't we? Made complete fools of themselves about that. I mean, in many ways, there's a lot of Gothic in this. The decaying aristocracy. Look at Lord Culver; they're corrupt, and I suppose this is an 18th century feature, isn't it? Which is no big surprise that it features in Gothic literature in the last half of the 18th century. The aristocracy are corrupt and debauched, and then we've got Lord Byron, who's into the early 19th century as well. But do you know about the Hellfire Caves? So the Hellfire Caves are great. If you're ever in West Wickham in Buckinghamshire, you should go. I've been a couple of times. And this is where, in the 18th century, Sir Francis Dashwood, a prominent politician and founder of the Orders of the Friars of St. Francis of Wickham, he wasn't really a religious man. It was kind of taking the pee out of religious orders, and he founded the Hellfire Club, and the chalk caves, and he got local workers to dig them out during a period of economic hardship. So that's actually quite nice, isn't it? And the caves became a meeting place for his own club, the Hellfire Club. And there were lots of influential figures, including politicians, writers, and artists. And it was known for its satirical take on religious practices, basically mocking them, elaborate feasts, and, according to some accounts, orgies and black masses. Apparently there were, I don't know where I got this from, but I have this half remembrance of like naked women standing in alcoves. And so the chambers were decorated with pagan symbols, classical allusions, and sexually suggestive imagery. What's his name? Benjamin Franklin was believed to be one of its members. So it was there was lots of secrecy. But this would have got out, and so again going back to this theme of the corruption and debauchery of aristocracy. I think, other than that, this story is it's a moral tale, isn't it? It's a morality tale. You think that, but one thing I think is different is that usually morality tales, we're shown the good and the bad, and very often the people can redeem themselves and become good, and we see there is a force for good in the story. Now, I think that force for good is largely absent. It has some kind of wan and weak presence in our narrator, who is kind of our moral compass in a sense. He represents basic decency. He's a flawed man himself, but at least he isn't an absolute, monster like Greatorix, who is vile, isn't he? He's vile. And once again, I think we play around with ideas. This is a man born into privilege, who is given the gifts of great charisma, good looks, physical attractiveness and prowess. He's a good shooter. Shootist, marksman, that's the one. And so, and yet, even so, he turns to, and I suppose that is the view. I mean, she wrote this in 200 years later, but I can imagine that your ordinary folk would look at, and we still probably do this, and these were celebs. I mean, the Hellfire Club, we don't have to go very far before we're hearing like stories from Hollywood and amongst the rich and famous. They're doing stuff like this still, apparently. Well, and Epstein and all that, yeah, I think they still are. They're still doing it. It must be awful being so jaded by life that you have to do things like this to get a bit. Me, I just walk the dogs, and if I see a goose, or as I was out today and there was some pussy willow, they call it, on the willow trees, the little fluffy stuffs, and then the hanging catkins, and I'm like, yeah, this is glorious. It was even mildly sunny. It was 8 degrees centigrade, so it wasn't hot, but it was pleasant. But if I was Lord such and such, that wouldn't do for me. I'd have to be, these days I'd be taking loads of drugs, and God knows what I'd be doing, something dreadful. But in those days they would do what he did. I think But what we're saying is it's a damnation story. It's not a redemption story in the sense of a morality tale. It is a warning, a cautionary tale, if you like. It's more like those paintings in the churches where we see the sinners being boiled and prodded by devils. It's like, this is going to happen to you if you are. There's no redemption in the story itself, but it serves as a warning to us. Whether it served as a warning to people in the 1950s, maybe it did. Maybe there was still. I remember being young when I was just a little boy in the 60s and 70s, and certainly the idea of eternal punishment in hell was not. Yeah, kind of. That was the party line. We believed it. So maybe there still was. I wonder if young people these days believe it. I suspect most of them don't. Anyway, but so that's its morality tale. The final sort of thing I want to say is about the standards of men and women in this, what they're expected to be, and I think there are two that are held up, and our characters fall short in both of them. So Alice Bulkley, we've already looked at how she falls short as a mother and a wife in her, and he pimps her out to various Italians for nothing wrong with Italians, or don't be offended. Italians aren't offended about stuff like that. They're just too easygoing. But I don't think, I'm not sure. Are the French? Anyway, but maybe. But I'm hoping to go to France next year, and I'm quite a Francophile, really, and an Italianophile. I'm an everythingophile, being honest with you. I'm a filey sort of person. But anyway, get back to the point, Tony. So, she falls short and she's weak, and so the highest virtue of a decent woman is to be a chaste wife, isn't it? And to fulfill her obligations as a mother and a wife, and be chaste and not be this voracious. I'm not sure she ever was. I think she was just a fool. But not to be a harlot. He accuses her of being a harlot, but who knows what happened in Italy? But maybe she technically was. But I think her failing in this is as a wife and mother, abandoning her children and her husband. Her husband comes across as solidly decent throughout, doesn't he? It's not even him going to India of his own volition. It's because he's got to go. It's his duty. So he's a big man for duty, Colonel Bulkley, and a good shot, as it turned out. And the fact he aims so that he ruins the face so he can't kiss another man's wife, I thought that was horrific, but nice touch. Anyway, what is the virtue of the man? The virtue that a man, and we see this, is he mustn't be a coward. So somebody says to you, you've got to fight a duel. It's about honor. You can't not do it. You've got to go. And if you, he would be ruined if he didn't fight it. So he had to come back and fight it ultimately, even though he was a coward. To be a coward is worse than to be dead. It's massively dishonoring, So those are the things. Whereas I think these days, if we were to transpose, I know she wrote it in 1949, but or slightly before. But if we were to transpose it from the late 1700s to modern times, and we were to hold men and women up to those standards, probably what we'd find would be that the idea of a woman abandoning her children, particularly, not necessarily a husband, but would still be seen as damning, really, a real failing morally, even today. For a man not to fight a duel over his honour, I think would be, yeah, so what? Funnily enough, with all the stuff that's going on in the world, there was this guy I shouldn't watch this stuff, on YouTube, and he was going around in London, and he was asking young men, because I think you may be aware that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has offered to send British soldiers. Anyway, never mind. But they're asking these young men, would you fight for England? And overwhelmingly no. So they just wouldn't. That's what they were saying. It's very. I mean, they said that before the First World War. Actually, most people before the Second World War. After the First World War, most people said no, but actually, when it came down to it, off they went. But yeah, but the point about those standards really, if you were today, you don't fight a duel, or some guy calls you out and you don't stand up for it, it isn't as damning as a woman, so the failings are not equivalent. I think in those days we were both equally tremendously damning, ruinous. But today, probably for a woman, that is still ruinous, for less ruinous, if you can have such a thing. I think ruin is absolute, so a little, I know, not as bad. But for the man, being a coward's still not a great thing, but it's far more socially acceptable than it used to be. Oh, okay. That's probably all I've got to say about it. I mean, I enjoyed the story. I will at some point return to pulp about, hideous things going on in mounds and blasphemous, squamous entities from cultist universe of King Pong. I just made that word up. Anyway, hope you're all well. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, if you see any of my stuff pirated anywhere that isn't on one of my channels, just drop me a note and I'll try and get it taken down.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
It's coming back, isn't it? Yes, God help me, I do.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?